She and her daughter were waiting for a ride by the roadside when a worker nearby began to harass them with rude remarks.
Hey, looking good, ladies!
She told her daughter to ignore him.
Hey, we'll keep you warm if you're getting wet!
Oh yeah, real nice! You kiss your mother with that mouth, asshole? Mom, you can't let boys talk to you like that.
The mother looked at her with a hint of surprise, and an unexpected smile spread across her lips, because in her daughter, she seemed to see her younger self from years ago. More than a decade earlier, it was still extremely rare for women to study law. Among more than 500 freshmen, only 9 were women, and Ruth was one of them. Getting into a prestigious university should have been something to celebrate, but after stepping onto campus, she quickly realized that women here faced prejudice everywhere. In such an environment, many girls chose to remain silent, but Ruth decided to be true to herself. At a formal dinner one evening, the dean looked at the female students present and asked with an arrogant expression,
"Each of you ladies report who you are, where you're from, and why you're occupying a place at Harvard that could have gone to a man."
Hearing this, the girls felt offended, but in order to maintain their composure, they forced themselves to smile. Soon, one girl stood up and replied that her father was a lawyer, and she studied law in order to inherit the family career. The dean remained indifferent, and after hearing her answer, he offered no comment. Then another girl said that she came to Harvard because she did not want to get married, nor did she want to become a nurse or a teacher, but before she could finish speaking, the dean abruptly cut her off.
That's not a very good reason. Next.
The girls stood there awkwardly, and the atmosphere at the table suddenly grew heavy. Suddenly Ruth stood up, accidentally knocking the tableware beside her, drawing everyone's attention to herself.
My husband Marty is in the second year class. I'm at Harvard to learn more about his work, so I can be a more patient and understanding wife.
This obvious irony struck directly at the heart of the matter. Everyone understood the meaning, except the dean, who looked displeased. On the first day of class, the students were required to present case analyses. She raised her hand first, ready to answer, but the professor's eyes passed right over her and called on a male student instead. The boy stood there hesitating for a long time, but still failed to give an answer. She anxiously signaled again, and this slender arm stood out sharply among the sea of male students in the law school. The professor glanced at the roster, remembered her name, yet once again chose to ignore her. The second boy's answer was also wrong, and for the third time she stubbornly raised her hand.
Question already, Mrs. Ginsburg.
Correction, Professor Brown.
Standing up, she analyzed the case with clear logic. A boy behind her argued back unwillingly, and when he realized he could not win the debate, he tried to interrupt her again.
If I may finish?
She stood firm and refused to give way, finally presenting a flawless answer. The entire classroom fell silent, yet the professor had no intention of praising the girl who had outshined all the boys, and with a light joke, he dismissed her excellence. But Ruth did not lose heart. She calmed herself and worked hard to improve her professional knowledge. However, during this time, her husband Martin was diagnosed with cancer. Ruth refused to give up. She encouraged Martin to actively receive treatment, while she herself entered a period of struggle that few could imagine. She not only had to take care of her young daughter and her seriously ill husband, but also had to ensure that her own studies kept up, and even had to attend classes for Martin, taking notes and completing his coursework. This exhausting life continued for 3 full years, and Martin, under Ruth's meticulous care, eventually overcame the illness. As for Ruth, she graduated with the highest honors, earning dual degrees from Harvard and Columbia. But this graduate, recognized by 2 prestigious universities, repeatedly ran into obstacles while seeking a job. After interviewing with 12 companies, she was rejected by all of them. Some said women were too emotional to handle the work of a lawyer. Some said female employees would be too busy with family matters and affect work efficiency. And even more absurdly, they claimed that if they hired a woman, the wives of other employees would become jealous of her appearance and worry that she might attract their husbands. With a simple gender label, the accusation of jealousy was placed on all women. They used all kinds of excuses to block women from their careers. But in truth, what they feared was that the wives at home who did the laundry and cooking would follow the example and no longer be willing to stay at home. Ruth fell into deep despair. She was diligent and talented, with an outstanding resume, but in the face of gender, all her excellence seemed meaningless, and she finally understood that what stood in her way was not her ability, but the world itself. Her husband encouraged her not to give up on her ideals, but after repeated setbacks, she no longer wanted to keep wasting her life like this, so she buried her unwillingness deep in her heart and accepted a teaching position at Rutgers University. For 10 years of teaching, she focused on the issue of gender bias within the law, nurturing generation after generation of legal talents. Yet she herself had never taken on a real case. Beneath the surface of a stable and happy life, there stirred a longing she had never fulfilled. Watching her husband gradually become a leading figure in the industry, she felt both pride and envy, until one day, a casual compliment from a colleague nearby changed everything.
You're a smart girl, Ruthie. You married a star.
Those words pierced her heart like a thorn. Could it be that a woman's greatest achievement was simply marrying the right man? The bitterness she had suppressed for years suddenly burst through the dam. On the way home, completely overwhelmed by emotion, she vented all her grievances to her husband for the first time. This sudden outburst caught Martin off guard, because in his eyes, Ruth's career in training legal professionals was just as meaningful.
You're out there training the next generation of lawyers to change the world.
Because that's what I wanted to do!
But she realized something clearly. She wanted to become the person who changed the world, not someone who only taught others how to change it. Soon an opportunity arrived, and Martin found a case for her. Although it seemed small, it completely changed the course of her life. The client, Charles, was the only son in his family, and since he was unmarried, he hired a caregiver to help take care of his mother. When filing his taxes, he listed the caregiver's wages as a deduction, but the tax authority ruled that he had intentionally committed tax fraud. According to the regulation at the time, caring for family members was assumed to be the wife's responsibility. Therefore, only women were allowed to receive this tax deduction. Perhaps the lawmakers had never imagined that a man might willingly take on the responsibility of caring for his parents, and winning this case would be extremely difficult. Although it appeared to be a fight for the rights of a man, in reality it was a battle for gender equality. Friends in the legal community all believed Ruth would certainly lose, because the American case law system follows the principle of precedent, and over the past century, every lawsuit challenging gender bias had ended in defeat. If the opposing side cited historical precedents, there would be almost no room for a breakthrough in this case. In order to defeat her opponent, the next day she took her daughter to meet the person she had always admired, a figure who had long fought for equal rights. She hoped to gain some inspiration, but instead received another discouraging response. The woman believed that the country was not yet ready, and that people's ideas had to change first before the law could change. Hearing this, her daughter was clearly upset. She supported her mother in continuing the fight and believed they should not abandon new attempts simply because of past failures. While the mother and daughter were waiting for a ride by the roadside, several street troublemakers approached them and began speaking in a teasing tone. She originally intended to ignore them, but her daughter firmly pushed back without hesitation. Ruth froze for a moment, because the courage and sharpness her daughter displayed was exactly what she herself had once pursued with all her strength.
You're a liberated, fearless young woman. 20 years ago, you couldn't have been who you are today. Dorothy Kenyon's wrong. The times have already changed.
The changes of the times suddenly gave her a renewed sense of hope. That very night she wrote passionately, declaring in her argument that the times had already changed. Old precedents should be abandoned, and the most important task now was to establish new rules. But gender discrimination had existed for far too long and had already penetrated every corner of society. Women could be dismissed from their jobs after getting married, and men also suffered from gender restrictions. They were discouraged from becoming nurses or teachers, and even within family roles they faced limitations. Changing this reality would be extremely difficult. Martin temporarily paused his own work at the company and devoted himself entirely to helping his wife find the key points for the lawsuit. Officials at the Justice Department believed this was a case they could win, but after hearing the opposing arguments, they still felt it needed to be handled carefully, because if they failed, the entire system of laws distinguishing between men and women might fall under constitutional scrutiny. they assembled the most powerful legal team, led by Ruth's former dean, and reviewed every federal law that contained gender-based provisions as their core response strategy. Their goal was to convince the Supreme Court justices that if the legal distinction between men and women were overturned, the entire social structure would fall into chaos. Children would come home from school with no one there, because their mothers would be working in factories or offices. Men and women would compete for the same jobs, and women might gain an advantage because employers could pay them less. In that case, the traditional balance of roles between men and women would collapse. Men would lose the ability to be the sole providers of the family. Divorce rates would rise dramatically, and society itself would begin to fall apart. But in truth, what they really feared was that women would gain the right to work. If women entered the workforce, it would mean the permanent loss of unpaid labor at home. Opposing women's participation in workplace competition was actually about protecting fragile male pride, and resisting women's freedom to divorce ultimately came from the fear of losing control over women. For these reasons, they would never allow such change to happen. At the same time, Ruth invited 3 fellow lawyers to simulate a courtroom debate in advance. However, because she lacked courtroom experience, the judge controlled the direction of the discussion throughout the session, and the topic gradually shifted from tax law to gender issues. Under the judge's continuous questioning, Ruth's train of thought became increasingly disrupted, and she could only respond emotionally.
Wrong.
You're screwing it up, Ruth.
Have you read the appendix attached
You're making
to their
the wrong
brief? These
case.
are laws written by men who think we are privileged to be excused from men's obligations, but it is not a privilege, it is a cage, and these laws are the bars.
This heated debate tore open the dilemma of gender equality and exposed the rigid thinking behind social division of roles. Those legal provisions that appeared to protect women had actually confined women to the home and locked men into the role of providers. True equality was not about the proportion of men and women in certain professions, but about breaking the rules that dictate what men must be and what women should be, allowing every individual the freedom to choose. But even the colleagues who supported her found it difficult to accept such an idea, believing the outcome of the case was already obvious. They advised Ruth to accept the out-of-court settlement proposed by the other side. For both parties, reaching an agreement at this stage seemed like the best solution. Ruth clearly understood this, yet she still felt unwilling to give up. Her reluctance was not because she personally could not appear in court, but because she felt regret that the opportunity to create change was right in front of her, yet she might not be able to grasp it. However, as the lawyer representing the case, she had the responsibility to explain the settlement conditions and reasons to the client. She conveyed the proposal from the tax authority to Charles. They were willing to pay a sum of money, but refused to apologize for accusing him of fraud. Just as Ruth had expected, Charles did not accept the offer. What he wanted was not financial compensation, but a simple sense of justice. Ruth finally made up her mind to give everything she had. She knew clearly that the meaning of this lawsuit reached far beyond the case itself. It was not only about the respect Charles deserved, but also about the future her daughter would live in, and the countless people who had never been treated fairly. The day of the trial finally arrived. The grand and solemn courthouse stood before them, and every brick and stone seemed to tell the story of those who had walked this path before. Today, Ruth would step onto that same road. After the trial began, Martin delivered the opening statement, arguing that Section 214 of the tax code was unconstitutional because it treated Charles unfairly. But unexpectedly, the judge suddenly disrupted his rhythm and forced him to answer questions about gender differences. However, this was not Martin's area of expertise, and the government lawyer seized the opportunity, following the judge's line of thinking and once again emphasizing that the traditional division between men working outside and women staying at home was a natural order, using this argument to claim that Charles, as a man, was not qualified to be a caregiver and therefore should not receive the tax deduction. He further argued that legal distinctions were not wrong, because they were meant to protect and assist women, and that the real harm to Charles did not come from the government, but from lawyers who used cases like this to push for radical social change. These words gave Ruth the opening she had been searching for, so she stepped in to replace Martin and pointed out that society had never stopped changing, from the first woman applying to become a lawyer, to women fighting for the right to work overtime, to women joining juries and even the construction of women's restrooms in recent years. If society rejected these changes, how could it ever move forward?
A generation ago, my students would have been arrested for indecency, for wearing the clothes that they do. 65 years ago, it would have been unimaginable that my daughter would aspire to a career. And 100 years ago, I would not have the right to stand before you.
You're asking us to overturn nearly a century of precedent.
I'm asking you to set a new precedent, as courts have done before when the law is outdated.
But in those cases, the courts had a clear constitutional handle. The word woman does not appear even once in the U.S. Constitution.
Nor does the word freedom, Your Honor.
The time for closing arguments had arrived, but the judge asked her to continue speaking.
Go on, Professor Ginsburg.
The principal purpose of Section 214 is not to protect women, nor to discriminate against men. It is to provide caregivers the opportunity to work outside the home. Charles Moritz was well raised to be the sort of man we should all hope our sons will become. Charlie deserves our admiration. We're not asking you to change the country. That's already happened without any court's permission. We're asking you to protect the right of the country to change.
She reiterated that the Constitution was not written for women alone, nor for freedom alone, but for equality. The original intention of Section 214 of the tax code was to allow anyone who cared for family members to have the opportunity to work outside the home. Her argument, and the request of her client, was not to overturn the entire legal system of the nation, but to correct outdated clauses one by one, for the sake of the law itself and for the countless people it affected. She respectfully asked the judges to begin that process of correction. Although the final verdict had not yet been announced, everyone already sensed the outcome. An unprecedented change was about to be born, and the course of history had quietly shifted. From that moment on, every legal professional could challenge outdated rules of gender discrimination, until women were no longer placed in a subordinate position, until bans on women working completely disappeared, until women possessed full citizenship rights, and until all 178 discriminatory clauses were finally abolished. With that, Ruth achieved her goal, and the film also reached its conclusion, but the truly legendary chapter of her life was only just beginning. In an era when most law firms refused to hire female lawyers, she stepped firmly into the legal world and won 5 victories for women before the United States Supreme Court. These milestone victories sparked a wave of gender discrimination litigation during the following decade. Together with many women who stood beside her, she helped turn one discriminatory law after another into history. In 1993, her husband Martin joined many accomplished women whom Ruth had once helped, and with their combined efforts, Ruth received a nomination to become a Justice of the Supreme Court. In the final vote of the Senate, she was confirmed by an overwhelming margin of 96 votes in favor and only 3 against, becoming the second woman justice in the history of the United States Supreme Court. Her name was Ruth Bader Ginsburg. What makes the story of Bader Ginsburg so moving is that what she challenged were the rules that people had long taken for granted. Women were often considered emotional or unprofessional, and many believed they could not handle certain jobs, while professions such as secretary, nurse, or kindergarten teacher seemed almost predetermined to belong to women. Some laws that appeared to protect women only limited their working hours, and those rules already assumed that all women would be tied down by family care and raising children, while also demanding that men must be the providers who leave home to support the family. But Bader Ginsburg never fought for the power of only one side. What she pursued was not the dominance of women, but equality. She fought for equal treatment for female military officers, and she also worked to secure benefits for full-time fathers. Through one case after another, she proved that gender discrimination harms everyone. When you define what women should be, you are also defining what men should be, and the result is that everyone becomes less free. In the film, when Bader Ginsburg was under immense pressure and nearly gave up the lawsuit to accept a settlement, it was her rebellious daughter who encouraged her to keep going.
Who's it for? It's not for me.
We enjoy the rights that the previous generation fought to obtain, And naturally, we also have the responsibility to expand the boundaries for the next generation. Society continues to change, and ideas continue to evolve. But the core of gender equality never changes, because gender is not the fundamental issue, and it should never be the problem. A recap can never replace the original film, and a truly great movie deserves to be watched again and again. See you in the next episode.